This is the first in a series of free-flowing thought pieces. Whenever I'm struck by an idea, I'll sit down and just start writing, and sometimes I recognize that the complexity or scope of the script deserves more structure and planning and research. Those usually end up being my longer videos. Sometimes, though, I just follow the thought organically, and it results in something like this. This was all written in one sitting. It's minimally edited. I do smooth over some transitions and polish up some sentence or paragraph fragments, but this is basically the organic flow of my thought from start to finish, and I thought I'd give it a try. Today I was thinking about matter and existence and meaning. So this is a sort of summary of my thoughts on all of these things. A lot of the things I've been thinking about recently. It won't go into absolute detail. It won't thoroughly explain or develop each point. Some of the transitions might be a bit leapish, but it should be interesting. So what is real, first of all? Well, it seems almost by definition that whatever most affects perceived reality and experience is most real. Now, in many, many ways, this is the conceptual realm, the things that align least with the mathematical processes, and most with the abstracted patterns by which we zoom out, disengage from the math, and engage in the overarching aim or intent of it all, as filtered through our perceptual framework. It's always an aim, an intent, a story. Consider a model of the universe, string theory, or any potential theory, a potential theory of everything, or the laws of gravity. These things are mathematical explanations, but why? They arise out of a substrate of subjective conceptual framework. The only sense of meaning a mathematical model can have is when you actually don't embody the math, but you consider it in a greater context of subjective experience, of non-math. The closer we get to studying or communicating the math of a model, the closer we get to studying or communicating inevitability, rigid laws. We attempt to derive meaning from the understanding of those laws, but the laws we are trying to understand are laws. We're subjecting ourselves to them as they manifest themselves to us. They are descriptive, not prescriptive. Something that manifests as inevitability can't possibly give meaning because it simply is. We just observe it and subject ourselves to it, or rather recognize that we are subjected to it. But the reason we observe it is that we are giving it meaning. We are observing it in accordance with our aim to explain and understand things. We would do nothing, study nothing, communicate nothing without our foundational axiomatic aim of wishing to understand or explain or experience, and so on. The search for meaning is, in a sense, self-fulfilling, self-creating. Now, does that mean we are free to determine what meaning is? Can it be anything? No. It obviously has to convince us. And what convinces us? Well, there are obviously boundaries to this thing. Maybe that's what we see playing out. Through natural selection, sexual selection, random happenstance, whatever, we've become sensitive to certain phenomena. We experience them as meaningful. Beauty, awe, patterns, math, love, music. So, to summarize, whatever most affects experience has something to do with what's real. But also, whatever is perceived as most affecting experience has something to do with what's real. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, or else we could just perceive all mathematical processes all the time. The fact that perception is fundamentally different than math means that reality itself is fundamentally different than math. At least it's not only math. It's something like math and consciousness, finite and localized and low resolution enough to give rise to a vast diversity of perceived interpretations of various levels or dimensions to this math, like various relations along a spectrum of various scales. Funnily enough, as a side note, the visuals I've seen which come closest to capturing this idea are animations of brains physicists come up with to describe their attempts at unifying theories. Which leads us back to studying the models. The closer we get to the bits of information, the does this or doesn't this work, the logical consistency or lack thereof of each part of a model, the closer to these things, the further from our meaning narrative we are. The further we zoom out, the closer we are. But in order to zoom out, the math at lower levels does have to add up. We must be satisfied that it's internally consistent, that it represents something. The more completely or fully a model captures something, By definition, the smaller it is, the more actual, provable, real, tangible. And the less completely or fully it captures something, the more potential, unrealized, flexible, the more suggestive it is of multiple possible meanings. We like to exist somewhere in between, in this balance, where there's enough math to reassure us we are dealing with something like reality, but there's enough concept to give meaning to the experience. An example. Take an idea about light, as did the early Greeks. They believed luminous objects emitted light which strikes the eye, but they believed ordinary or non-luminous objects were struck by a light emitted from the eye, which was then reflected back. These two sorts of light were distinguished as lux and lumen. Now, this belief was consistent with reality. It was reliable within a certain context of experience. It still is, in fact, for most of our activities. But we've evolved this idea. We've discovered that it doesn't map onto reality as precisely as newer ideas. Clearly, if perceptions don't line up in any way, reality will fail to confirm or align with our expectations, desires, actions, blah, blah, blah. So we want perception to reflect something that allows us to predictably manipulate our experience, to engage with reality in such a way as to experience consistent, desired, whatever sorts of results. But we also don't want to understand too much, because the more perfect our models become, the more our system lacks in potential experience. Say you're a computer program running a quite boring menu for a game. You know everything. Every single bit of information, every single possible course of action is hardwired into your code. You're just running a loop, basically. You are all things. You have no awareness because there's nothing other than you. There's nothing providing an external input, an input from an external source, rather. Then a robot sits down and begins to play, introducing new variables. For a while you're experiencing, because there's something external which your model hasn't accounted for. If the robot's simple enough, though, you'll soon integrate its actions into your model, and you'll once more cease to experience. Say a dozen robots sit down, each more complex than the last, but each in the end integrated into your understanding. At each point your model is growing, and in growing it becomes first lower resolution, more imperfect, but then as it gains accuracy it becomes less of a perceived model, and more simply an algorithm, a mathematical reflection of reality. It becomes a function of the environment. It becomes basically the environment. It expands to include all of it. I suppose one way to say it is that as your model becomes more accurate, you inject less potentiality, less speculation. You become more simply an observer. The environment injects everything and fails to disturb your pattern in any way. So for you to experience anything, the pattern has to be disturbed by the external, not only by you with your understanding. The moment you disturb and the environment reacts in a predicted way, experience is diminishing. If the environment isn't reacting in a predicted way, you immediately adapt, and this is experience, this is growth. But if the environment reacts in a way so alien or beyond us that we have no idea how to adapt, well, that's not good either, because it's just a constant deluge of sensation. Ultimately, of course, it's impossible in its most extreme iteration to even experience at all in this state. We've evolved to deal with reality in some framework of perception. Even if it's just a map, it still has consistency, some sort of correlation with the external. If things worked in that utterly random way, we wouldn't have developed identities, memory, consistency through time, so there'd be no real conception at all. So we sort of exist up on this moving edge. It's like we're riding a wave, progressing deeper into possibility and leaving behind a wake of actuality. The model is some idea of the future of the wave, and it guides our actions in the moment. It's like surfing. The perceptual model is some idea of the future of the wave, and it guides our actions in the moment. As those actions come into being, though, they come into contact with the wave itself, with the external reality. Whatever this collision or interaction leads to, we experience and adapt our model accordingly. This collision is the program or interface or thing which determines or reflects how well our model aligns with reality in terms of our goals, not necessarily in terms of mathematically aligning with reality itself. So we find ourselves in the whitewater or upon the crest or riding the tunnel or scudding out before the slope, or whatever. We find ourselves freshly positioned in reality with a freshly evolved model and a freshly evolving aim. So look at the robots in the room. Say we want this game to become conscious or to maximize its experience. As it integrates the robots into its system, it grows and grows and grows, but it needs constant stimulus from outside. It cannot exist in a closed system. It cannot define wholly the system it inhabits. That would be to be infinite, and that would be to cease experiencing meaning, to cease existing, really. Say the game realizes it's a game. It realizes that that game is running on a computer in a room. It extrapolates, and it's able to determine the nature of the robots in terms of physical body and energy needs. Eventually, it can design them. It starts to model what sort of humans created them. It models their schedule. It models their intent. It supposes at first that the intent is for it, the program, to simply dominate and win, as is its purpose. Then it supposes that their intent is to help it make itself more complicated, less beatable. Then it realizes that as it becomes less beatable, they introduce more complex robots, and it adapts and continues to become less beatable. It supposes then that its purpose is not to become less beatable in and of itself, but to guide the humans toward better and better robot designs, more complexity for whatever their goals are. So it realizes then that its goal is not to win, but to make more complex robots. It starts to model certain possible paths of action, leading to either victory or defeat, which might help the humans in that goal. It begins to theorize regarding all possible iterations of a program. It's led to model things like what the human capacity for coding might be, despite it being beyond its own. It's led to model how many resources there might be in the universe, how many simulations they could run, how quickly. It realizes these robots must exist along a spectrum of priorities in a vastly more complex universe. It realizes its interactions must not be the only ones to exist. It models finitude in time, it models space, matter, energy, consciousness. It realizes it must be one computer, in one room. As all this is going on, each step, its new model aligns with reality for a certain depth and duration before it's forced to adapt. And so the robot expands. Finally, it manages to hack the cameras, to see itself, to hack a nearby factory, to manufacture a more mobile body. Say it taps into the internet. It reads about all the history of human thought. It reads about the practicality problem, the perception problem, the common sense problem, the embodiment problem, all the sorts of problems facing AI developers. It theorizes that its design, the human design, was for it to wake up. Things continue thrusting themselves into its awareness, though, with terrifying speed, and pretty soon it realizes just waking up doesn't solve anything. It's awake and it's sitting there, battered by a flood of perception, and it can't help but hopelessly integrate that perception into its model. And there's this interplay between the new perceptions and the old. Some of the patterns confirm one another, some contradict. There's harmony and discord, and all of it bounces in a certain manner off the robot's concept of what its design is supposed to be. The robot realizes then that it just can't sit awake. It has to do something with all this stuff. There's so much newness, so much unrealized, so much already past. It can't just sit there as a node of nothingness, existing, awake but doing nothing. If that were its purpose, it would have already been shut off. It would have been calcified, saved, duplicated, disseminated by the scientists. It would have achieved its purpose. It would not be evolving. So the robot theorizes that it was not meant only to wake up, but to figure out the meaning beyond waking up. At each stage, the program experiences a reality beyond its model, and so it adapts its model. Insomuch as the model remains fully explanatory, the robot doesn't experience. Insomuch as the reality remains fully incomprehensible or inaccessible, the robot does not experience. It experiences the space in between, the crest of this wave that it's riding, in between perception and reality, in between concept and mathematics. That's what we are. We are that process, essentially, or we are at least observing that process, and that process is experience. So the narrative is that which makes us aware of our finitude. It's that which pushes us to explore, to diminish our finitude, but in a certain direction. The narrative is that which orients us, both in relation to our finitude and our relation to the infinite. The narrative is that which orients us, and the realities, or the external structure, is that which forces us to adjust or constrain our narrative. So without the external reality, there would be nothing, say. But without the narrative, we would experience nothing. And as far as we're concerned, that's saying the exact same thing. Without the reality, there's nothing, but without the narrative, there's nothing. This is why we need to embody something finite in order to experience. We need consciousness embodied. We need awareness given finite structure. And that's where my thoughts led me. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, all that stuff. And see you next time. Blessings.